What if a single, forgotten decision changed your entire life? A few years ago, I took a chance, a $5,000 gamble on something no one took seriously, Dogecoin. Fast forward to today, that decision not only turned my life upside down but revealed the harsh reality of who I could truly trust. This is the story of how a long-shot investment saved me when my own family tried to tear me down. I was always a bit of a loner, the kind of guy who kept his cards close to his chest, worked hard and didn't ask for handouts. But life, as it often does, has a way of throwing curveballs when you least expect it. Before the pandemic hit, I thought I had my life together. I was working a steady job, renting a small condo, and living the kind of life that felt manageable, if not perfect. But what most people didn't know was that I had made some risky investments during the 2017 cryptocurrency boom. Everyone was talking about it, the hype was everywhere. Bitcoin was the obvious star, but I saw something in the smaller, lesser-known coins. One of those was Dogecoin. At the time, it was barely on anyone's radar, but I saw the potential. I threw $5,000 into it, thinking that even if it went up a bit, maybe even just doubled in value, it would be a better return than Bitcoin, which had already seen some growth but was harder to move. It seemed like a good gamble. I didn't think much of it at the time. Sure, it was a risk, but I figured, why not? If it worked out, I'd have a bit of extra cash in my pocket. For months, I didn't think about it much. The price fluctuated here and there, but nothing substantial happened. I checked in on it from time to time, but I was mostly focused on making ends meet, keeping up with bills, and getting by. My family, especially my younger brother Dan, thought I was crazy. They'd mock me for spending my money on digital coins that most people didn't even understand. Dan, my younger brother by 3 years, was always the golden child in the family. No matter what he did, he was the one who got the attention. Growing up, he was the clear favorite. While I was punished for standing up for myself, he was given a free pass. He was the type who would take what he wanted without a second thought, even if it meant stepping on others. I didn't mind it when we were kids, but as we grew older, his entitlement became harder to ignore. Dan had gotten married young and had 4 kids before he was even 30. I didn't begrudge him his family, but I couldn't help feeling like he had everything handed to him. And his wife, well, let's just say we didn't get along. She had a way of provoking me, acting superior, and when I'd respond, she'd play the victim, always making me look like the bad guy. My parents, despite knowing how manipulative she could be, adored her. They'd always make excuses for her behavior. But what infuriated me the most was that Dan and his wife didn't do anything to support themselves. Dan lived at home with my parents despite being married with 4 kids. His wife refused to work even though my mother, her mother-in-law, was taking care of their children all day. My parents gave them a roof over their heads, while my mother became their unpaid nanny. My sister-in-law didn't lift a finger to help with the kids, yet she was good with words. She kept everyone tied to her, convincing them she was the one who deserved all the help. Dan, on the other hand, didn't seem to care. He'd act like When the pandemic hit in 2020, it felt like everything fell apart at once. I lost my job and couldn't keep up with the rent on my condo. I had to sell almost everything I owned, from my furniture to my car, just to make ends meet. Desperate for a place to stay, I bought a cheap camper, parked it on my parents' property, and asked if I could stay there. But they only agreed if I paid them a rent I couldn't afford. With no other choice, I hit the road, living in parking lots and public streets, scraping by. It was the lowest point of my life. The worst part was that my family, especially Dan and his wife, couldn't help but mock me. They'd laugh at my situation behind my back, calling me a homeless bum. It hurt more than I wanted to admit, but I didn't give up. I worked part-time jobs, hustled, and did whatever I could to save money. Slowly, I built myself back up. By 2021, I was in a better place. I managed to get a small studio apartment, and for the first time in a while, I felt like I had control again. I still felt the weight of my family's judgment, but I pushed it aside. I had a life to rebuild, and no one was going to take that from me. Then, one day while I was sitting in my apartment scrolling through the news, I came across an article that caught my eye. Crypto surge Dogecoin hits $1. I didn't think much of it at first. It seemed too good to be true, but I clicked on the headline out of curiosity. To my shock, it was true. The price of Dogecoin, the very coin I had bought years ago, had surged to 73 cents per coin. It felt unreal. I had completely forgotten about it. My mind raced as I opened my crypto exchange account. Could this be the break I needed? I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Back in 2017, I had spent $5,000 on Dogecoin when it was worth 1/10 of a cent per coin. I had bought around 5 million Dogecoins. Now, with the coin valued at 73 cents, my investment had skyrocketed to $3.65 million. It was incredible. I didn't waste a second. I sold all of my Dogecoin and watched as the money hit my account. I felt a mix of disbelief and exhilaration. For the first time in years, I felt like everything had finally clicked into place. With my new fortune, I didn't rush to spend it recklessly. I wanted stability. I bought a modest 4-bedroom house in a nice neighborhood. It wasn't a mansion, but it was more than enough for me. A place I could call home. A place where I could finally feel at peace. I posted about it on social media, sharing my pride in the accomplishment. After everything I'd been through, after all the mocking and belittling, this felt like all my hard work had paid off. I had built something for myself, without anyone's help. Proud of my new home, I posted about it on social media. A few weeks later, my parents, brother, and his family showed up unannounced, somehow finding my address despite my efforts to keep it private. They barged into my house like they owned the place, snooping around while my sister-in-law flashed me a smug, unsettling smirk. The red flags were everywhere. Dan eventually asked to speak with me privately, while the rest of the family conveniently waited on the front porch. He came straight to the point. I should let him and his family move into my house. His reasoning? I was single with no kids and he needed a better place for his growing family. He even suggested I could live in my camper in the backyard while they took over the main house. No mention of rent, of course. When I refused, Dan became increasingly aggressive, yelling that I didn't deserve the house. He claimed that our parents had already approved the arrangement and insisted that I had no choice but to comply. That's when I pulled out my phone and started recording. The argument escalated as my parents and sister-in-law stormed back inside, surrounding me and piling on the pressure. They repeatedly chanted, "Just do it for Dan," as if that would somehow guilt me into submission. My sister-in-law screamed that she was pregnant and needed the space. When I pointed out that I had no obligation to her or her family, she flew into a rage and physically attacked me, landing a hit before my brother restrained her. I held up my phone, showing them that I had recorded everything. I threatened to call the police if they didn't leave immediately. My parents insisted I come to my senses, but I stood my ground, making it clear that none of them were welcome back. As they left, my mother gave me one last ultimatum, saying I had a week to change my mind. I didn't. A few days later, I was wrapping up some work at the grocery store I owned. It was a small, family-friendly store in the neighborhood that I'd purchased after my financial windfall. I enjoyed running the place and often stepped in to help the staff when needed. That particular day, I'd come in to cover for a part-timer who'd had a family emergency. I was dressed casually, blending in as I stocked some shelves and greeted customers. That's when they walked in. Dan, his wife, and my parents. They didn't recognize me at first. Dan's wife strutted around, loudly complaining about prices and grabbing items off the shelves. My parents whispered to each other, likely discussing how they could spin this to their advantage. As they approached the counter, one of my employees, a young man named Kyle, began ringing them up. Dan's wife, ever the dramatist, declared, "We'll be shopping here all the time now, you should feel lucky to have us." Then, in an almost comical display of entitlement, they tried to leave without paying. I stepped out from behind the shelves and said calmly, "Excuse me, you forgot to pay." Dan's face turned a deep shade of red as he finally recognized me. "What are you doing here?" he demanded. "What am I doing here? This is my store," I replied, crossing my arms. The shock on their faces was priceless. Dan's wife tried to laugh it off, claiming it was all a misunderstanding. But I wasn't having it. "Either pay for your items or leave," I said firmly. Kyle stood behind me, wide-eyed but ready to back me up. Realizing they were out of options, they hastily paid and left, avoiding eye contact. As they walked out, I couldn't help but feel a sense of closure. They had tried to take everything from me, but I'd built a life they couldn't touch. This experience was a painful reminder of the dysfunction I left behind. While it's heartbreaking that my own family would try to take advantage of me, it also affirmed my decision to prioritize my well-being. My house and my store are more than just properties. They're symbols of my hard work and independence. No amount of familial guilt or entitlement can take that away from me. If you enjoyed this video, please like, share, and subscribe for more content.